All right, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is the Circuit Studies Daytona presentation. I am Mike Skeen. I see Johan Schwartz over here on the other side of the screen.
Good evening.
Half a country apart at the moment, but glad to be here with you to do a little bit of a study of Daytona. It's a great track. I really love going there. I've been able to do a couple 24s and Continental Challenge races. Very challenging circuit, even though it looks pretty simple on the track map, but lots of high speed, lots of brake zones, and pretty rewarding when you get it right, because the lap is fairly simple, but you got to do everything just right to get the full lap time out of it. So I think we'll enjoy it.
Yep.
Yeah, we can add there.
No, I myself have driven the Grand Am Master Speed 3. Been in a TA2 car as well there, and a couple of front and rear wheel drive BMW, Hondas, and so forth. So it's very challenging, and obviously when you pull in there, you can't be nothing but impressed. It's an amazing facility, and obviously with a vast amount of history. So just driving it and having the opportunity to drive it, if you're going there for the first time, it's quite the experience.
Yeah. All right, we're going to switch over to show the screen presentation. Full screen. Look here, if you've been able to join us for any of the previous ones, circuit studies throughout the year, we have all those on demand now on the website. If you missed any and you need to pick one up, have at it, and we'll go ahead and move forward here. Like the other presentations, this one, throughout the presentation, we'll use some white arrows to point out some of the corner worker stations, just to give you an idea before you get there where to look for them. Not always manned, but give you an idea of what to look for. Also, throughout the presentation, each slide will have a little track map on the top right to update you on the current location, so you can kind of follow along a little bit easier. If you have any questions throughout, go ahead and try to use the chat window over on the right side of the screen. You can type in whatever you like there, and we'll try to cover it throughout as we can if it fits into the conversation. Otherwise, we'll get back to them during a Q&A session at the end. Also, if you have the information packet already, hopefully printed out, you can kind of follow along. You might find the track map or the blank track map helpful for taking notes throughout the presentation. But we'll go ahead and move along. So starting out, the lap near the start finish, going through the tri-oval. Obviously, look up and check out the flag stand up there. Nothing too dramatic to talk about here, other than you're starting to see the brake markers, signboards over on the left side in the grass. Just get ready for that turn one brake zone. Some cars, you can start down low right along the yellow line, be running the shortest distance all the way around. But as you get to the brake zone, that makes it a little bit tighter. So typically, this is about the time where you'd start moving up, if you're not already kind of mid-track, to straighten the brake zone a little bit, make it a little better. And then we have a little bit of an overhead just as you're transitioning down off of the banking onto the infield. It looks getting through turn one, and then the short little S's section following it. You see there's a little section of grass that starts near the pit out just as you get back down onto the infield. So you've gone past all the grass at the tri-oval. You see the asphalt break, and then the grass starts again. That's where you'll kind of visually aim to clip sort of a first apex, if you will, while you're braking, then let the car out towards the middle of the road. You don't want to get all the way track out right for that turn in, just because of the crown of the road. And then you'll look for an apex around the start of the wall, or just after the start of the wall that divides the pit out road, and then track out and straighten out the S's. Pretty straightforward, pretty flat, but some little things that we'll get to throughout the next few slides to show you. So here we are getting a little further down into the brake zone. Depending on what type of car you're driving, start looking for that, either the one board or the end of the grass up ahead as good references, or there's also a blue line on the wall to driver's right that you can use as a reference. But pick out where to start and get comfortable. This is a big time gainer if you can compress the brake zone through here and get some confidence. It's obviously a very good place to pass once you've gotten a draft through the oval section and the tri-oval. So you set up some good passing maneuvers here, and it's really important to be able to compress this brake zone as you get comfortable with it.
And certainly in the beginning, when you come here for the first time or revisiting it again, And even some people that have been there for many times, I've seen them being a little hesitant compressing the brake zone because it can be a little intimidating as the track, kind of goes to the left, and people tend to maybe look straight, so they feel a little lost. So it's very important you get your eyes into the left side and really kind of build up to it. But like Mike was saying, compressing the brake zone here is super important, and then being able to also, once you've done that, come in with good brake release. But we'll cover that here in a little bit as well.
Yeah. And as we were saying, sometimes you can stay left and it makes that transition a little bit smoother, but unless it's a pretty low top speed car that is making the turn a little bit sharper there, and so it makes the brake zone a little bit tougher, and it's also a longer distance to go further up onto the towards the wall on the right. So unless you can really run the short distance and it doesn't compromise the brake zone too much, it's usually best to be kind of mid track or higher to start there on the way in. And then we're just starting to get a little bit closer down to that transition. You see just on the edge of the screen, the end of the grass section from the tri-oval. Obviously, typically a pretty good indicator for your brake point if you're in kind of a mid to high speed car. Anything with decent downforce will be getting pretty close to this transition before getting on the brakes. And then you can just barely see over on the right side of the wall, just over here, there's a little stripe that can also be a good reference marker for using it, a brake marker. And then your eyes should be up where that arrow is pointing to look for that next grass section that divides the pit out lane. That's where you want to try to apex and get nice and tight. Again, we're just coming down through the transition. You can see there's lots of painted marks and stuff, some pavement changes, so it's not smooth, and it just wants to induce brake lockup kind of all the way through, but try to be nice and smooth and compress it early while you have a lot of momentum on the car where it's less likely to get a lockup. So here we are kind of just getting into the infield section of pavement. This is where you're clipping the left side edge a little bit, and there's a little bit of a compression here. So just as the road gets a little bit of a crown and you get a pretty good grip, but then as you start to go over that crown, it starts to lose it and it will want to lock up, especially the left front coming in here. So make sure the car is nice and stable. You're starting to get to where you can release a little bit of brake pressure, and just look ahead towards mid-track, mid-right side, so that you can set up for how wide you want to get and set up your apex. Also notice now that there's a lot of paved runoff over to the right, so you've got really like acres of pavement to slow the car if you get in too deep. But as you'll see a little bit further around, there is a wall towards the left, so if you try to make the corner for too long but you're real deep, it is possible that you get to a wall. If you're really deep or throttle sticks or you have a brake problem or anything, it's best to go off right as early as reasonably possible and just do a big U-turn out there and rejoin if possible. Or if you have a real problem, you can keep going down the oval after merging. So here we are, we're just starting to get a little bit right of center. Again, you don't want to get all the way out to the right edge of the track where that pavement transition is. It's a little bit more off camber. You've gone over the crown of the road more, so it makes it difficult to turn the car back into the left. But just as you've gotten out to this point where left side tires are kind of mid-track, you want to be looking ahead for that start of the pit out wall where that tire barrier is. That you basically want to aim for that tire barrier, and then the apex will be just after that. You also have a pretty good crown to the road once you get in there, so it really grips up pretty nicely and you can rotate the car pretty well, but you might need just a little bit of a trail brake to help the nose of the car point in initially there before you get to that cambered section. And then again, straight ahead there is that wall we were talking about. So if you're getting to this point and you're still really deep, you got a lockup or something like that, you can see how that wall would start to arrive pretty quick. This is kind of the point of no return where you really need to go right unless you're sure that you can make the corner.
And it used to be a lot worse, so it is better now, but you can get there in a hurry if you have an issue. So yeah, definitely be careful.
Basically only like 2 lanes outside of the track before you get to that wall. So it is pretty close once you get in here. But this is what you see once you're just arriving at that wall, and you can see even a couple of people have nicked the tire wall. There's little rubber marks on the edge of it. But you basically aim to just miss the tire wall and then keep left side tires right on that white line on the edge. Like I said, pretty good camber there. The car really starts to rotate well if you get it all the way down to the left side. And then from this point, you should be able to just start to pick up the throttle from that apex and start tracking it out. Again, we're going to be looking for the camber of the road to change a little bit on the exit. So you want to make sure the car is fully rotated and pointed well through the exit so that you can get on the power without creating an understeer going over the crown of the road at the exit. So just here, this is, mid-track, kind of where I would typically track out in most GT cars, maybe just right of center. But again, if you get too far out towards that track out curbing in a higher horsepower car, something that's really transferring a lot of weight to the rear and losing grip from the front, once you get over that crown, it just kind of sucks you out there. So, slower cars, Miatas or whatever, you can, be a little bit more comfortable tracking it all the way out there without too much trouble. But do be careful that it doesn't compromise the next little right kink before you get to turn 2. So here, both of these apexes, the S's, typically not referred to by turn number, but just kind of the S's following turn 1. Both of them, you can clip the curbs a little bit, but they do have a pretty good rumble and a little bit of a rise to them. And then there's a pretty sharp drop behind them. So typically it's not a good idea to straddle the curb. You want to keep the tires inside on the track and on the curb at most. You don't want to risk a puncture or anything or damaging a tire, because certainly there's a lot of load on the banking. So any way of compromising that could really be a problem later. And just keep your eyes up, nice and smooth, light steering inputs through here, and not too complicated. Once you get to turn 2, which we'll go over in just a second, you don't really have to track all the way out right. As you can see, that the line kind of ends, but just as you track out of 2, whatever naturally comes from the car, and then hold that steering input and bring it back to the left.
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so now looking at this map after we've gone through the corner, so be really diligent about picking out a break point that you start off at. Be disciplined with hitting that, know where you did it, and know if the car behaves a certain way, that either to change it back or forward. I mean, you should, in a sense, hopefully be moving it forward as opposed to be braking too late. That's when things can happen. So the way is full threshold braking, coming in and then trailing off the brakes. You should be on the brake and then into the apex and picking it up. If you feel yourself having to release the brakes too soon, so you're not having some brake while you're turning the car, then you have, in a sense, broke too early. Then you can move your brake point forward a little bit. Again, there's time to be gained, and you'll get the car handling better by carrying a little bit of brake in, down, almost to the apex.
Yeah, you don't want to be coming off of the brake too early, because it really helps to have that weight on the front of the car to help it turn in. Again, dealing with that crown of the road, sometimes there's not a whole lot of front end grip trying to manage that camber to the road. So all you can do to keep some weight on the front and help it turn is best. And also, this is a track as important as anywhere to be very careful with the stability of the braking. A lot of times you're going to want to trim the downforce from your car if that's something that you can adjust. And so you have, if the car is all trimmed out, you have to make sure it's still pretty stable under braking. Make sure that it's not pitching too far forward and causing instability in the rear. Make sure the ABS is dialed in if you have anything for that, or at least know how the ABS is going to respond once you get little lockups going over bumps and transitions. And make sure your brake bias is just where you need it to keep the car nice and stable. You don't want to have too many lockups on the front coming in, or you also don't want to get any lockups in the rear and have the rear end swap ends. So make sure everything is really dialed, because having a very comfortable, well braking car on this track is going to pay big dividends. You have to have confidence on the brakes in many places around here.
Yeah. And so we have the passing map that we'll show later, but this is a corner where you can both pass on the inside as well as the outside, but make sure that you have the car, so the person that you're passing, the other car that you're passing, that you have presented yourself well. So if you, and some people, it's a very common place to be passing on the outside, especially out of class cars that drives the proper line. You come and you brake deep, you carry a lot of speed in, but then obviously the car at the exit or corner will start tracking out. And if you are not there at that point so the other car can see you, that is a problem and potentially push you off the track. So presenting yourself well is very critical in the whether you pass on the inside or outside.
All right, moving along to turn two. Again, just clip the curve a little bit, eyes up, nice, smooth steering inputs. Generally, you won't have to track out all the way right to the grass, but just keep, don't pinch it all the way left either. You don't want to create an oversteer, especially if it's wet or anything like that. You don't want to create a problem just trying to get back to the left to set up for braking for three or anything. Just let the car kind of go out 2/3 of the way, however it feels necessary, and then hold that steering input left to kind of set up for the brake zone going into turn three. And here is an overhead of turn three. Not quite symmetric, but about a 180-degree corner. You can see there's an access road on the exit that kind of divides the track out. There's two track out curvings, and you kind of clip the first one just on the end of it and then track out fully all the way to the final curve, the one all the way out by the grass. You can also kind of see just where towards the end of the yellow line section, the curbing at the apex kind of tightens a little bit. So it creates a little bit of a tighter radius right at that section, a little bit of a point to the curbing, which will become visible once you're looking at it from track level. And then also this data, which is data that we have as a sample. You can see the driver is driving in the center, braking in the center of the corner or center of the track going into the corner. That's a pretty common practice, and sometimes it's a defensive line to use that. Typically, if I'm all the way, all by myself, I'll go most of the way left and just start very early with a slow hands turn in, kind of where that alternate turn in is for the other section of course. And you're just feeding it in with a lot of trail braking and then smoothly transitioning to more steering input to the point where your steering input is the tightest at that apex during the end of the yellow there, and then you start to pick up the throttle. But it is very common for people to brake more towards the center, and I think that is because there used to be a little bit more camber to the or crown to the road. Now it's mostly flat, I would say, through here. There's a couple like little lumpy bumps in the brake zone, but it's not too drastic. And to me, it's a better practice to be starting to load the car laterally over a longer period rather than to go straight in from the middle of the road and then ask to turn really quick. So that's why I typically will move a little bit further left, maybe not 100% all the way to the left white line, but most of the way there, just to start an early turn in.
And keep in mind that when you move further to the left, you'll actually start crossing into the pit exit, the dotted line that's there. So, just be aware of there may be some cars, especially if you're in an endurance race, coming out of the pit. So the speed differential may be quite a bit different, as well as it may be a new driver with cold tires, whatever it may be. So just be aware of that. If there is a car over to the left, that person may not be up to your speed.
Yeah. Fortunately, there is generally pretty good visibility there. There is a wall dividing, through the S's, but typically you can see cars over the wall, and you have a pretty good, merge coming in there. So not too big a surprise generally, but for sure you do want to watch out for guys on cold tires or just, cold head coming out during a race. And you can also use those hashed lines for good, braking reference points, whether it's third or fourth dotted line, whatever the case is. Those can be really good indicators for where to brake because there's not very good signage typically on the left. So here we are just coming out again, tracking out sort of right side, but not fully right side from two, and then just holding that on a diagonal to brake across the track towards the left side of the road, kind of aiming more or less at the corner worker, but just a little bit to the right of the corner worker. Again, there's the end of the pit out lines, use those as brake references, and then some of the later ones typically get covered up with rubber, but you can still sort of see them, use them as a reference point. I will also, just one other thing, as far as out of class passing, this is one that's very common because faster cars get a little bit, held up through the S's, and so they really want to pop out to the right usually to pass on the inside here. So if you can hold just a little left to leave them a lane, that makes it a lot easier for them to get alongside during the brake zone and facilitate a clean pass. If you stay over right too long, then they want to try to go left and go around the outside, and that makes it a little bit messy. So here we are, most of the way left side. You can see we're just starting to come alongside that alternate turn to the right, where there's a couple of cones. You're going to start pretty early here with a nice slow hands turn in. So you're just barely bending the car towards the road, kind of middle right side of the road. Just starting to barely load the car laterally with still quite a lot of brake pressure. You're going to be looking ahead and trying to get, all the way down to the apex as you get far through the corner. Now we're just starting to see the apex curving, so you don't want to aim to hit the very beginning of it, but you do want to start to look for that point where the radius tightens a little bit in the center and you kind of get a point to the curb. And so I'm just aiming to sort of start to pick it up, and then as we get a little further along, you can just see where that radius is a little bit tighter, and that's where I'll really run over the curb, have the car fully rotated, and start to pick up the throttle and open the wheel a little bit. It's very important that you're patient here. If you have an understeer, you might need a little bit more trail braking to make the nose work for you. And make sure you're waiting for that car to rotate so that you can go back to power. You don't want to have, induced an understeer on the entry and then just try to pick up the throttle and ride it out. That's just going to make it worse, create more tire wear, or, could create an oversteer for a rear drive car. But whatever the case, you want to make sure the car gets fully rotated enough that you can pick up the throttle, commit to it fully early, not to have to back out of the throttle later in the track out. So we're just starting to see the exit curves. We're just going to barely nick the end of the left side curb. Lower power cars can use that a bit more because you can run a little bit wider radius. High horsepower cars, you run just slightly tighter line to straighten the drive off the corner and get good power down. You're coming from very low speed, so you got a lot of torque available generally in a GT car or a high horsepower touring car. So you want to be able to make sure you're getting all the power down nice and early, and you kind of straddle the line on the way out that divides the access road, and then just run it all the way to the track out curving on the left and start to draw a straight line over the right side.
And one thing, if you do get early on the gas, especially if, say it's a front wheel drive car and you start picking up a push, if you are getting impatient, you'll find yourself actually potentially tracking out, and you may go over the curve that you're, in a sense, are aiming to hit at the very end on the left side. So it can be pretty rough. I think we've all done it. That has been there. Try to pick it up as early as we can and use, in a sense, what we think is all the track. But it is pretty upsetting for that. So just be patient when you're rotating the car there and not picking it up too soon.
And you can also see, it's tough to see from this angle, but you can see how the curb kind of blocks a little bit of the access road, about where that arrow is pointing to. That's because the curbing is quite a bit higher than the access road, and so there's a little bit of a ramp up and then a ramp down on the backside. So it's tempting, especially an ST car or something along those lines, or a chump car or whatever, if you're just trying to maintain the highest minimum speed possible, it's really tempting to widen that radius a lot, but you'll end up kind of jumping off of that curb, which can be pretty harsh on the car. So it's definitely something to watch out for. Be careful with how much of that first one you're using.
Yeah.
And again, from the track out here, just start drawing a line down to the right side. Do be careful to look in the right side mirror as you're coming out here, especially in any sort of lower class car, because higher speed cars are going to want to pass on the right. And so this can be an area where there's a lot of confusion with traffic. If there's somebody right on you, go ahead and let them go by on the right side. But obviously you want to set up on the right side. So as long as you have time, it's best to hurry up that transition and get all the way over to the side, just to make sure that they can get through and have the inside, for the corner down there. And just to look back at turn 3, one other thing to point out is the runoff area here. You can see there's a little bit of grass out there, a little bit more than the width of the track, but that goes away pretty quickly, especially if it's wet or even dewy. in the morning or something like that. If you have a lockup and get off the edge of the track, you can run out of space pretty quickly, even with just a lockup. So it's, there's a tire wall there. The speeds aren't terribly high, but it is a pretty common spot to bang up the nose of a car with a lockup. So do be careful with that. And then if you do have any sort of mechanical problem or something, it's good to know about that access road at the exit. You can always cut the grass a little bit early and turn in, do a U-turn and get behind the wall. There's always safety trucks and stuff there if you have an issue. And like we said in the turn-by-turn guide, anywhere around this track, basically the left side is the best direction to go. That's what's always going to get you to the infield, and that's typically where safety crews and tow trucks can get to you quickest. All right, so moving along, we're setting up for the little dogleg turn 4 on the infield. Very high speed corner, pretty deceptive. It can be a little bit intimidating going into it because you can't really see all the way through it, but it's very quick, good camber throughout, so you have reasonable grip. It's just hard sometimes for guys to get the eyes up enough all the way through to anticipate where to track out. But definitely try to maintain as much speed through here as you can. If you're in a fast car that is a little bit lower grip and you have to slow down, you're not going to be able to go flat. Give it a little breathe on the entry. I can't really think of hardly any car that I've had to brake here or something, but a lot of people do. So yeah, it's possible there's some that do need to brake, but most of them are going to get away with a lift. And so try not to have that little confidence dab of the brake as you're coming in here. Breathe off the throttle a little, let it turn in, get some grip, and then start rolling back onto the power and try to minimize that lift as much as possible for your car. And then look for the visual reference. After the one marker off to the side, look for that white line to kind of turn away. And it's pretty deliberate. The line's going nice and straight, and then it takes a little right kink. And right at that point is where you want to turn to the left. And again, nice slow hands. It's fast corner, so you don't need quick hand speed. It's just going to be nice and smooth. Eyes up, aiming towards that apex and trying to carry as much minimum speed through as you can. Here you can see there's pretty good camber at the apex. The most camber you're going to get is at the apex, so you have a good bit of grip. The curbing, just like the rest of it in the infield, pretty good little ramp angle to it, pretty good rumble as well. So you don't want to use it too hard. It also, in anything that's more aero sensitive, the more you get up on that curb, the more it's going to disturb the airflow under the car and that sort of thing. So you might actually lose a little grip by using that. So anything that's soft, no problem, you can clip the curb, but stiffer or higher downforce cars, a lot of times you just nick the edge of it and then try to be back to throttle at this point. Really, whatever you're driving, if you had to slow down on the entry, that's okay, but by this point you should be feeding back to power and letting the car track out. You don't want to compromise the exit for the sake of setting up turn 5. We'll get to that in a minute, but really it's best anyways to be kind of right side or center track later, going into turn 5. So it's not important, not a good idea to try to sacrifice this corner. You want to try to maintain as much speed through here as you possibly can.
And it is the classical high-speed corner that you want to have the stable platform mid-corner. So get the lifting done early and then start feeding it in. So you are not only to minimize the sacrifice of the exit, but as well as having that nice stable platform with the throttle on as you go through. Just like turn 1, build up to it. Don't go in and in a sense scare yourself. On worst case, spin the car, hurt it, whatever it may be. Find a point where you are lifting and feeding the throttle back in, see if you are comfortable, and then build it up. Because if you start turning in and you realize, oh, maybe I should lift, and you then lift with some steering in, that is very upsetting for the car. And if you're going fast, you all of a sudden gain a lot of grip on the front tires. The rear may get a little loose. And you may not spin out or anything, but you will get maybe a big slide, and that you lose. Then you start losing confidence. So build up to it and get your reference points down.
And a lot of times, if you're driving a car with some level of downforce, the car is likely more trimmed out at this track than almost anywhere else you're going to go. So if you're used to having quite a bit of high-speed grip from that downforce, this corner is one where you're really going to feel that lack of downforce. The car is going to feel a little bit nervous as compared to what you might be used to on higher speed corners at other tracks where you've got the downforce level up a bit. So do be a little bit careful with that. Also, a lot of times you can get, it's a very one lane track at that point going through the apex, and so it tends to get very dirty offline. There's no other cars, going out there. It's almost never too wide through there. So if you get offline, you can pretty quickly find yourself losing a lot of grip and getting a lot of pickup on the tires. So do be careful to make sure you're online on the way in and setting yourself up well. You can see lots of runoff on the track out. There's grass just about everywhere to the right. There's a wall to the left. So make sure if you do have any problem, drive the car straight and try to get it collected and slowed down. You've got a little bit of pavement, inside the horseshoe for the alternate horseshoe. So you have a little bit more grip there to slow it down if you get out there for whatever reason and collect yourself. But definitely don't try to, if you're running out of room in the track out, don't try to pinch the car. Don't lift really late, really abruptly with steering input, because you don't want to hook the car over to the left and end up in that wall over there, which is pretty common. So definitely keep driving the car, keep it fairly straight, and just work with it. You have a little bit of time there to slow it down and typically collect it.
And kind of turn one with the passing, really be aware of, especially if you're in a slower class car and there's quicker cars, like Mike was saying, there may be cars that are trying to pass you on the inside coming out of 3. So be very careful, because you're accelerating hard, you start to pick up some speed. So once you start going over to the right, that you are very much clear on that there may not be a car on your inside. So it's one of those areas where you have a fairly quick high speed in the car, and where you have to transition over to set yourself up. And, so definitely check your mirrors before you start going over.
All right, moving on. So this is the overhead for the turn 5 horseshoe. You can see also not a perfectly symmetric corner. A little bit, the road just begins to turn in and bend in a little bit before you really get to the center where you arc it in a lot. Also, the apex is a lot tighter right in the middle. You have a little bit of pavement runoff for when you're straight ahead on approach to the corner, so you have a little bit of room to collect if you get in too deep on the brakes. But just keep in mind that the wall on the outside is pretty close if you do get to the grassy section, so you're going to run out of room a little bit there. But the line here on the overhead looks a little bit unconventional, because obviously you would expect to be going fully out to the left to set up for the widest arc on the way in. The thing is, here there's a lot different camber to the road, and so you're trying to not get over the crown of the road too much there where it's starting to go red to yellow. You don't want to be all the way out to the left, because then you have to go over the crown a little bit harder. And then you also want to make sure that you get the car straight enough through the exit that you can get to the power nicely all the way through on that long track out section, while you still have a good bit of steering input in it. Higher horsepower car, you can see how if you hold it a little bit tighter towards the end of the apex curving, that'll straighten out that exit and allow you to get to power more. If you're a little bit lower horsepower or higher grip car, sometimes you can let it go a little bit more mid-track or closer to the center of the track at the end of the apex curve there, and not cause yourself any problems. But then you certainly track it all the way out fully to the exit curve. So here we are on the way in. You've started braking from the right side of the road, coming from the track out at turn 4, and then we've got the alternate horseshoe going off to the right. But you want to just start basically letting the car track out over towards the center. You're looking ahead for where, at this point the track is starting to bend itself. So basically you just hold the steering straight, and the car, will travel out towards the middle of the road, basically while the road turns away from your travel. So yeah, you just brake nice and straight. The car ends up taking itself out towards the middle of the road, and just as you get kind of right side tires on the center line or straddling the center line, and you're starting to release a little bit of brake, that's at the point where you're going to bring the car back in towards the apex and start adding a little bit more steering input as you release the brake. Here we are. Yeah, you can see the paved runoff area off to the left. Just as you've started to reach this section, you're a little bit more mid-track. You're taking advantage of the camber to the road, and you're just starting to get a visual on the apex curbing. And you're just like the first horseshoe, you're looking for the point at which the radius on the inside tightens a little bit and creates that point to the curb. That's where you really want to have the right side tires all the way down, touching the rumble curb. And that way you get the car fully rotated at that point and can get back to power soon. Make sure the front end is responding well. You don't want any understeer at this point, so make sure you're trail braking as much as necessary to get that front end to respond. And then as it gets all the way down towards the apex, then you can start to pick up a little bit of throttle and unwind through the exit. Here we are, just clipping the apex a little bit. You can see that point where it's a little bit tighter. Just as you brush that, you get pretty good amount of camber through the center here, gets a little bit of grip, and so it really will turn well in the middle. And then as you start to go through the exit, let it point through and get back to power. This, for this camera that we're using here is on a Trans Am car, so very high horsepower. That's why it's much further right side, keeping it nice and tight towards the apex, the end of the curb. That way you can straighten the drive off and get full power and get all that power to the ground, whereas typically in a prototype or STGS car or whatever, you can let it track out a little bit further towards the center of the track, and that amount of steering input is not going to compromise going to power. You'll still have room to track it out and you won't have to lift. But again, just like the first horseshoe, make sure that once you start picking up the throttle around the apex, that you can fully commit to it pretty early and you don't have to back out of it any later. You want to be fully committed once you start going to it. And here we are, the track out. You just lose the camber advantage right near the track out. You see there's a little bit of a camber or a crown to the road here, so you've lost a little bit of grip, but you go ahead and let the car track out all the way left. You can also see that track out curve is a little bit lumpy. There's kind of a couple undulating bumps through there. Nothing too abrupt, but you do want to make sure that you get the car pretty straight as you touch those. The first bit of the curb is nice and smooth, and then it has a little bit more of a rumble towards the far outside left portion of it. No big surprises here other than in the wet, that whole area there, that channel can kind of collect a little bit of water. Some puddles there, especially in the low spots of those lumps and those bumps. So do be careful of those. And then just start drawing a line over to the right side. Again, with traffic management, slower cars will typically kind of track all the way out and let any faster cars that are immediately behind go ahead and take the right side. But if you have time, it's best to go ahead and get over to the right and let anybody that's faster take the left side and get the inside braking for turn 6 coming up. Again, just a little bit of a review looking over that horseshoe. Again, coming out of turn 4, don't compromise the exit there any. Track it out all the way. Start your braking from the right side of the road and just let the car kind of go straight while you're braking. A little bit of a bend as you get to the, past that alternate horseshoe, a little bit of a bend to the car. And again, that's slow hands, just, slowly adding steering input as you're releasing brake. But you don't want to let the car get all the way fully track left. It gets it over the crown of the road a little bit, and it makes that turn in a lot sharper. So you're just over a very long distance starting to add some steering input, and then getting to where it's the sharpest point, right at that point in the curb in the middle of the at the apex in the middle of the horseshoe. Get the car fully rotated back to power as early as possible. You want to spend as little time as possible off the pedals, so you're carrying brakes in nice and deep, lots of weight on the front of the car, getting it rotated very quickly over a short period in the middle of the corner, and then picking up throttle nice and early to get a good drive off.
And so a couple of things here. When you approach this corner, especially if you are brand new there or if you haven't been there in a while, it's very common, especially if you didn't get the rotation that Mike was talking about. You find yourself, you may apex maybe a tiny bit early, but very close to where the apex that we have pointed out, but you haven't rotated the car because you are not getting the rotation that you want with the brakes on it. So if you start apexing early there, and the way the car is positioned relative to where you need to go, you'll find yourself actually going early off the track if you don't have your eyes up. Especially as you're coming down fast, we tend to start turning in early because early kind of makes us feel comfortable. We're not carrying a lot of G's, and that is going to kill your rotation as well as your potential exit coming out of there. So be careful with that. And if you then find yourself you have apex too early and you start picking up the gas too soon, you'll find yourself, if you was like, I got to be committed to staying on the gas, you'll start finding yourself getting a lot of steering angle in there to accommodate what you're trying to do, which we know turning the steering wheel is like putting the brakes on, so it's not helping you any. Plus, you are having some serious tire degradation, or you may find yourself go off on the exit of the curbs. So build up, get your reference points, get the rotation in the car, and really make sure that you have that rotation so when you start picking up the gas, you're not going to run out on the exit.
A really common problem here too is braking too early because it's really hard to see the corner. You track out a turn 4 with a lot of speed, and then the road is kind of starting to bend, but you can't really see where it's becoming sharp. And so a lot of guys will get on the brakes pretty early, and then they kind of release brakes and coast for a long period of time, and then you don't have the weight on the nose when you go to turn. So definitely work on compressing the brake zone here. We talked about how there isn't a ton of runoff, but there is a little pavement there if you really need it. So try to work on it, inch it down to where you're compressing that brake zone a little bit, and you still have a really good amount of brake pressure on as you're getting out to the middle of the road just before you're coming back. Once you're really starting to increase the steering input, that's really the only point at which you should be releasing much brake pressure, but you want to make sure there's a pretty good amount of weight on the nose to help it when you're really starting to add some steering input. And that'll help with not turning in too early, because a lot of guys that do that, kind of coast in, they start turning in early just because they feel like they're at the speed they need to be, and they're not looking far enough ahead. So do make sure you're pushing that entry speed, keep that up as high as you can, and help the weight transfer, get the car rotated on the way in. And here we are, a little overhead at turn 6. Fairly straightforward again on the overhead, but a little bit more complex once you start to analyze it. The brake zone has a couple of little bumps in it, nothing too significant. There's a couple little, camber changes, dips, all very subtle. But as you're going through the apex, it really is more complex than it looks on the overhead. You want to make sure that you're getting a lot of rotation done early so that you're getting the car fairly straight for the exit. There's, again, a couple of transitions and camber, the crown of the road through the exit. And, there's a fair amount of steering input all the way through that long exit. So any higher speed, higher horsepower cars are going to struggle a little bit with the forward bite. So you want to try to manage to get the car as straight as possible, as you're trying to get power down onto the banking. Obviously, this is the start of one of the longest straightaways, the second longest on-throttle section. So it's really important to have, the best exit speed through here as you can. You can see there's a little track out curb on the way out to the banking. It's not very useful, in most cars. Maybe some Miatas, SD cars, that sort of thing. You might find yourself out there trying to widen the arc as much as possible and roll as much speed through that first apex as you can, because you can go to power nice and early, and so running that little bit wider arc will give you more, higher minimum speed, and then the exit is just, it is what it is. You're already up full on the power. But in a lot of GT cars and stuff where you're struggling for forward grip, you're really going to try to compromise that exit a little bit. You make the radius at the first apex a little bit tighter in order to straighten and drive off a little bit and get back to full power as soon as you can. Here we are on the way in. Pick your braking point on the right side. You can usually pick a curb or kind of middle of this access road, end of this access road, whatever the case may be. The point where that grass comes in, something along those lines will give you a good reference point for where to brake. The brake markers signs are kind of way off to the side and too far apart to really be that helpful. So pick, a reference point that's good for you. There's a little bit of a bump. You can see where it's rubbered up a little on the track, where there's a dip and then a little bit of a peak. So watch out for lockups there. But a good place actually to get a pass done, especially out of class. A lot of times you can get by somebody before you're trying to get this exit onto the main straightaway. You don't want to be caught up, if you can reasonably. You don't want to get caught up behind a slower class car or whatever to get that exit speed. And then just as you're going past the last curb, there's this little bit of a darker asphalt patch over the right side. Kind of middle of that section is about where you're starting to turn in. You're going to be using a little bit of trail brake to help rotate the car on the way in. Because again, this first apex, the radius is pretty tight through here. So trying to get a lot of weight transfer, weight on the nose to help it turn in, especially in a Porsche or anything mid-engine. A lot of these corners, they're so tight, you want to get a lot of weight on the nose to help them turn, and then you get good power down. But fairly straightforward on the way in. Just get your eyes up towards the apex nice and early, and then try to get a lot of the rotation done right at this point. So you're going to use the curbing a little bit. You can see there's a pretty good amount of camber on the way in. There's a couple little small bumps that you may get a little hop out of the car or whatever, but pretty quickly in the early exit, I'd say about 2 to 3 car lengths past this apex, you're going to lose that camber advantage. So try to get a lot of rotation done while you have that camber, and then that way, as you lose it on the way out, the car is already pretty straight. You can start to feed a little bit of power. Also, this is the backside of that wall, the barrier at turn 1. So pretty quick, there, you'll arrive at it if you have a problem, but it is paved up to that. And then if we just go back a little, you can see there is a little bit more room off to the right. So if you do come in here and there's a throttle hung up or whatever, you can try to go to the right, but be careful because you will end up in the exit of turn 1 there. So this wall divides, turn 1 and 6, which are fairly close on the map. You can see on the top right. So if you do have a problem and for whatever reason you're using the runoff, whether it's from turn 1 or from turn 6, make sure that you're aware of where the track is on the other side so that you don't get into that while you're trying to collect the car. But anyway, back to the apex and early track out. One reference point that I use is this little sealer patch, which is mostly on the right side. So you can see it's just from the center seam there. And typically in higher horsepower stuff, I'm keeping most of the car left of that patch. Might be straddling, the edge of it, the corner there. But by keeping it a little bit more left side, that straightens the drive off of the corner and gets the wheel straight sooner so that you can get, the throttle closer to the floorboard a little bit quicker and try to get good exit speed. If you end up closer out towards the yellow curbing there, you can see how it takes more of an arc to get back towards that left apex later on by the wall where you're going up on the banking. So you're holding steering in the car longer and it's harder to get back to full throttle.
And there's also a part of the track where we were at where when you start picking up the gas, and if you have a fairly high horsepower car, you will actually, if you're too aggressive and too far out, it will pick up an oversteer. So the car all of a sudden will kick the back end out on you. So be careful with that.
Yep. And then as you go through the exit, you're just starting to look ahead, try to spot that wall as early as possible. It's going to feel like it's one to push up towards the wall, but then as soon as you hit this banking at the black line there, you pick up a lot of grip going up that hill. So it's pretty straightforward generally. You're not usually that in danger of wanting to hit the wall there, but you do want to track out, go ahead and let the car go up the hill a little bit, just to open the radius of the corner as much as you can. And also you can kind of ride back down and you get a little bit of momentum going down the hill back down to the lower lane of the banking. You can see just tracking it out. Watch for the lights around the banking on the fence. Will give you an indication of flags. Different groups use it different ways, but typically you'll have the green and yellow and or flashing yellow there as needed. And then the big thing is kind of traffic management around the banking, because guys that don't go there, don't know what typical etiquette is, can cause problems because there should be no ambiguity about where you're going, whether you're the faster or slower car. You typically want to stay to the low lane unless you're passing somebody. Treat it kind of like a highway where the right side is the fast lane and the left side is the slow lane. And you want to have good etiquette about it. So don't just kind of wander around aimlessly in the middle of the track, because then it's hard for a faster car to know whether to go low or high or not. Try to keep it down near the yellow line, and don't be 5 feet off the yellow line, because then nobody can go inside and it makes it tighter if people are trying to go around the top. So be nice and tight to it. It also gives you the shortest distance around the bottom, so it's actually worth a couple of tenths sometimes going all the way around this long distance oval. And then also be aware of a draft. Anytime you can pick up any little sniff of a draft, it can make a big difference around here, because the closer you are to your terminal velocity, the more any arrow is going to help the efficiency of the car, and so the more top speed you can get. And a lot of times qualifying with a teammate or something along those lines, you can really pick up a lot of time if you're working together well around the banking. The other side of that is you got to work with somebody that you are close enough in speed to that you're not losing anything anywhere else, that you're not getting each other's way going through the infield or the bus stop, but be smart about it. Or if you're just lucky and you catch somebody at the right time, right place, you can get a good bit of time picking up some draft around the banking. Just a little recap here. Again, looking over turn 6, getting most of the rotation done on the way in, trying to straighten the drive off. Usually not tracking out all the way the yellow curve unless you're a lower speed car, lower horsepower, where it's not as big of a deal. You can still get the throttle nice and early. But typically the real struggle here, especially on, as tires get older, or if it's hot a day and, grip's a little lower, it can be a really big struggle to get the power down on the exit here. But that's what we're trying to do, is get the best exit speed through here if we can.
And really focus. It is, again, to reiterate, focus on the exit speed. Sometimes when you feel you have picked up a good exit speed, then you say, okay, I'm going to start braking later. And you may still be able to accomplish braking later and still get a good exit speed. But sometimes you get greedy and you forget about the lost exit speed, especially if you don't have data you can look at, or predictive time or whatever. So you feel like you are gaining on the entry, but in essence, you have lost all that plus more on the exit speed. But you tend to forget about it because the braking late and still getting to the apex feels rewarding, but you can't necessarily feel the 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 miles an hour that you gain by setting yourself up properly. So be careful not to get greedy on the braking.
Yeah, and the brake zone is pretty straightforward. So most of the time, you're going to get, fairly close to the ideal brake point, in the first few laps. You can get comfortable with this brake zone before a lot of the others. So you're going to be a lot closer to what the capability is on the way in. And therefore, beyond that, you're just going to lose time. You're going to start to push too hard, and what you think you might gain on the way in, you're probably going to lose more on the way out. So just, yes, you want to maximize the brake zone, but don't get greedy. Don't try to find more there. Work on the exit speed here. Again, like we talked about, just trying to get back down to the bottom after you've tracked out. Follow the yellow line around. And then as you come around towards the track out curving, or the track out of the corner on the backstretch, make sure you give a little look on the right side mirror. Make sure nobody's coming alongside you through there. It's actually fairly common for guys to start tracking out to the curb when a much higher speed car is already planning to go there. They might be a long ways back, but they've committed to that line already if you've been down low. So it's really important here to look way back. Assume you're on the Autobahn and there's somebody flying by you at 50 miles an hour more. You really want to make sure that you've got all that sorted out before you come over in front of somebody, even if they're pretty far back, because it can be hard to change direction at that point. And then the bus stop, which really is a key element of this track. It looks pretty simple. You don't think much of it because it's just kind of out there on the backstretch, but it links the 2 longest straightaways. It's very high speed, it takes high commitment. You really have to work on compressing the brake zone here, but again, not to the point of sacrificing exit speed. But because this one, you are at high speed, almost terminal speed coming in, and then you're leading into the longer straightaway after. There's really not a lot of room to play with on the entry. You have to get the braking right, but you also can't sacrifice the exit. So that's why this one's really, really critical. Also, you can see down at the bottom of the screen that wall is really close. So that is typically where guys will mess it up if they do, is coming in, braking too hard, or trail braking in and fighting the car, kind of pinching it down to that first left-hand apex, and then creating an oversteer and just, you know, hooking it around, sliding into that wall on the left. That's why there's so many tire walls along there. The alternate is kind of going straight and going through the grass, which is better, but a lot of times can rip off a splitter or something along those lines. Or if you're dropping wheels right along the edge of the curb, a lot of times there's a hole and you can kind of hook a wheel, hook a tire coming back on the pavement, and that can create a flat or whatever, bend a wheel. So yeah, definitely be careful. You want to use all the road, use all the curbing at most of the places, but not obviously taking it too far. But ideally, what we want to do is start pretty early with our turn-in, trail braking it into that first curbing, using a lot of the curb, and being more or less parallel to the travel, you know, the line on the inside of the curb, where you're just kind of following the edge of the grass through that first apex. And then the second one on the right, where the yellow is, you're just trying to be kind of right at the tip of the curb. You don't want to use all of it. You can see how that curve or that corner is not as sharp as the last two. So if you're really tight on that one, that leaves you too far inside in the middle of the chicane and sacrifices your exit. So you have to leave a little bit more space at that second chicane, or that second apex in the chicane, so that you're more mid-track in the middle of the corner, and that gives you a straighter drive off. And then both of those second, or the second portion of the curve, second half of the chicane, but the third and fourth apex, you're going to use all the curb, try to straighten it out. The last one is a little bit tough to see because it's kind of low. You're coming over like a very slight rise where you're transitioning over the crown. So it's tough to see that from the driver's perspective down low. You can't quite see that curve real well, but you want to be able to use all of it. Once you've made that apex, it's pretty easy tracking out from there. But, again, working on traffic management on the way out, if you're just run the left side the shortest distance if not necessary, and typically right lane will be for faster cars to start passing as soon as they get out of that apex.
And it is a lot of fun. It's very rewarding, and it really rewards good pedal work when you come up to it. Good initial braking, good brakes, good release coming in, and smooth on the gas when you start picking it up. If you pick up the gas too hard, it's very easy, especially in a front-wheel drive car, to pick up a push. And again, then you'll find yourself potentially start putting more steering in to try to get to the apex, the third apex, the last one on the inside right. You'll start picking, maybe turning too much, and you killed all your exit speed. So be very smooth and know what the car will do, and then maybe pick it up ever so slightly and then squeeze the power as you start straightening it up so you get the absolute best maximum exit speed. Now, sometimes you'll also find that after the fourth apex, the one on your left coming out of there are cones, and it doesn't take very long before those cones are all scattered. So there may be some on the track. They are hard cones. They can potentially do some damage to the bodywork and so forth. So just be careful both hitting them if you're the first one to hit them, which you shouldn't be if you do it right. But secondly, if there's some that get scattered on the track, they can do some damage.
And along those lines, a lot of times you can see pieces of splitter or whatever scattered around on the exit. So
absolutely,
watch out for debris. Even if nobody's losing parts or cones, there's a lot of times dirt and stuff, and it becomes a very narrow one line, all the way through. So you have to be careful not to get a little bit off, or you pretty quickly lose some grip.
And also, some people, if they, the third apex, the last one on the inside right, they can pick up the gas or don't get to the apex, they'll find themselves having to straighten it out and actually completely go over the fourth apex, and that's when you pick up a lot of dirt from there and hit the cones and potentially do damage to the splitter if you have that on the car. So be diligent, focus on the exit speed and really have good pedal work in there with the steering.
The other thing to look at is obviously the backstretch is continuous, so you can really work on compressing the brake zone here and have plenty of room to bail. You'll have to probably thread between some cones to stay straight, but you do have that option of staying straight, and it's better than barreling in there and going through the grass where you can damage some other stuff or just get crap on your tires. But do know whatever the rule is for your group when you're there. A lot of times you have to come to a complete dead stop before rejoining the track. And so that obviously is going to ruin a lot, lose you a lot of time, but know exactly what the rule is, because sometimes they are very, sticklers about it. And if you don't, if you roll the stop a little bit or whatever, sometimes you'll get a drive-through penalty or whatever the case may be for your series. So know what the rule is there, because there's a good chance at some point you're going to need it. It might just be, somebody else barrels down in there trying to make a bonsai pass and you have to bail on it. But know what the situation is for your group. All right, and so as we're coming in, looking at the 3 marker here, very few cars are going to be braking this early, but it's a good indicator of where you're starting to get to that brake zone. As you're just coming down the backstretch, it can be hard to pick out how close you are because everything's pretty flat. The fence looks the same. You're going really fast, so do pay attention to when you're starting to get to those markers so that where you're to start prepping for your brake zone. Most cars are going to be a little bit closer to the 2 marker here, whether you're before or after. It's somewhere more or less around here for most cars. There's also a little bit of a light bar kind of sticking out just ahead. Some cars are down that far, or maybe even further, but it starts to, you're typically starting around here somewhere with your braking. And then a little bit further along, you're starting to see the 1 marker, which is kind of a good turn-in indicator. And again, it's very slow hands turn in, but you've done really high speed compression of braking. And then once you're getting to this point, you're still fairly heavy on the brakes, but you're starting to trail off of it a little bit, adding just a little bit of steering input and aiming to, put the car at the beginning of the apex curve on the left side. They're just nice, long, slowly adding lateral input to it and getting it down towards the apex. So just at the start of it, you're starting to pick up the grass. You run basically just all the way around the left side of the curve where the grass is. Also, sometimes be mindful here, they can add little curbing strips sometimes, which make the curve a little bit higher, the rumble a little bit harder. I think that's usually only for the IMSA weekend. So if you're just there for club day or whatever, the curve's nice and low. It's not that big of a rumble or anything. But if you are racing there, check it out. If you can do a track walk, it might be worth it. But sometimes they will modify the curving a little bit here, add some reflector strips or something to make it a little bit higher. But even without those, there's a little bit just of a hop the car will get going over the curb and from the transition off of the very mild banking on the back straightaway. You get just a little bit of a hop, and so you want to have nice, direct steering, but don't pinch the steering too hard, because as the car lands, you don't want to have extra steering input in it, which can hook it to the left. But just nice kind of light input as you go over those hops. Let the car take it as it will, but make sure that it doesn't bounce over to the right. You want to keep it kind of to the left so that you're basically late apexing this, but that will set you up to get through the rest of this as best as possible. So again, as we get to this second apex on the right, not using all of it, you're not going to have right side tires all the way over the grass typically. You kind of just run over the tip of the curb so that you can let the car out towards the left side a little bit more. If you're maybe in a really high downforce car or something, you might use a little bit more of that curb, keep it a little bit tighter all the way through. But most cars you're going to be a little bit happier if you run just 2 feet wider and get the straighter drive on for the exit. So again, eyes up, and you're just letting the car kind of touch the center of the track. And at this point, you should have it rotated, looking at the final 2 exit apexes and starting to pick up the throttle. If you can't pick up the throttle at this point, you probably went in too hot, or you didn't have enough weight on the front, so the car wasn't responding once you transition to the right. if the car is starting to pick up an understeer in those first two apexes and it's not wanting to rotate in the middle here, you need to make a little bit of a modification, to get more grip on the front end, get it to respond a little better so that you can start to pick up the throttle nice and early. And then you're just starting to hit this third and exit curb. Again, using all the width of it as much as you can. And there you can see is a pretty good visual of how the crown in the road kind of hides that last apex. It's pretty tough to see. You can see the cones that Johan was talking about that can be good visual indicators, but a lot of times you'll lose those. So don't rely on those. You have to have pretty good muscle memory to know how the car is going to go over the crown of the road. It kind of hops as it transitions to the final apex. But you want to just make sure the car is getting nice and straight at this point. You should be 100% throttle and getting a good exit onto the final straightaway. And again, using the full width of the road there. And you can see how there's some fill dirt, but that goes away typically. And so you can drop a wheel in there and damage one going back on to the asphalt. So just be careful. Use all the road, but nothing more. And then as you start to track out here, you can let it go, towards the wall, but usually you're not going to have to go all the way out. Typically, you can just run mid-track and kind of bring it back down to run the inside around. Nice little overhead shot again.
And one thing I want to point out, this is one of the probably the most common corner, or the corner that may be in between gears. So for a lot of 5-6 speeds, some people will have maybe that tendency, if you're in 5th gear, to go down 2 gears and try to do it in 3rd, and it feels good. The car's revving up, and you may not be on the rev limiter per se. But what that sometimes create is an overslowing of the car, and not that smooth throttle application when you got out of the exit, where you may be able to pick up a push, or too much torque to the rear tires in the rear car setting. So try to work on going through that in 4th gear. So you're not rushing, you're not trying to overslow the car, and you're really rolling the speed through there and then picking up the throttle nice and smooth. It gives the car a little more stable platform, squats the rear end, and gets out of there smoother. So try to work on that. If you have that doubt, what gear should I be in? Always try to go for the higher one.
All right. Yeah, nothing too significant through here, through the exit. Again, you can kind of track out middle of the road or whatever. Just nice, smooth inputs through here. Try not to scrub any extra speed. Running the short distance to stay down in the left unless you're passing. Pretty straightforward through there. And then as we exit the NASCAR turn 4, coming back towards the tri-oval, you can let it track out. Higher speed cars are going to feel a little bit more comfortable, and you'll minimize a little bit of scrub if you let it track out up towards the wall. But a lot of times you can hold it down a little bit more left, and definitely, again, check the mirrors, be mindful of cars coming from pretty far back. And if you're racing somebody, you're going to probably want to protect that left side. So make sure the car is comfortable coming out of there and holding it down to the left, so that you can protect the yellow line and keep the car down there, so that anybody has to go around the outside to pass you into turn 1. Also, it keeps it a shorter distance, but don't think that the shortest distance is always the best thing. A lot of times you can lose a little bit of mile an hour by pinching the wheel and trying to hold the car right down on the bottom. Assuming there's nobody around you that's going to cause a problem, you can let it just, keep nice and light inputs on the wheel, let it track just a lane or two up if that's what feels comfortable, and let the car go where it needs to. And then as the banking kind of flattens out, you just let it kind of make its way back down to the left side as necessary. And then coming into the banking again, faster cars are going to kind of typically stay mid or right side track. Slower cars will start to move, or will probably be already down on the left side, and just staying along the bottom into the tri-oval, and then maybe around start finish working their way up to the top, kind of straight line the brake zone at 1, but nothing too dramatic. You can see the pit end is over there on the left. definitely practice. If you have to do any pit stops, definitely practice a couple times coming in there and picking a good braking point, and don't just lollygag down in there. You can gain a couple seconds sometimes by knowing exactly how hard you can brake coming down in there. Pretty much right as you come off the banking through turn 4 on the oval, you're going to come down under the yellow line, down onto the apron, and then brake nice and hard. I mean, you can stay full throttle for a ways on the apron and then, brake, but pick a good spot and, just like you would on the track, work on narrowing down to compress that brake zone on the way in if you have to do any live pit stops where you might need time. And also don't cut the left side too early, because if you have pit boxes there on the very early part of the pit straight, you don't want to be running through those, even if it's a penalty box or anything. Most of the series are going to want you to go straight to the fast lane on the right side there, so don't shortcut that. But not too much else to talk about. We'll go through a couple of the maps, but if you already have your information packet printed out, you'll have these track maps in there. This is the quick reference guide that we recommend having, just to have a little glance at, to remind yourself of some things going into a session. You can have it at the track, have it in the car if you want, so that you can look at it just before you buckle up and go. Now, you can also make a couple notes in there, make it customized to you. You can take notes on what gears and what corners, that sort of thing. What brake reference markers are good for you. And then we also have a wet driving map, a couple little notes. We talked about it a little bit, but obviously the banking around here drains really well, so you don't really have water accumulation there. But in the infield, you can have a couple little puddles here and there. The road is mostly crowned, as we've already talked about, but you can have a couple little small puddles and stuff because there are some flatter sections. But really, this place is not too bad. In the wet, it drains pretty well. Sometimes you can get accumulation at the apex of 4 if it's a really heavy rain. But definitely look for offline braking, offline grip around the apexes and the horseshoes around the wider arc, to look for grip, and nothing too extraordinary through there.
It's almost scary how fast you can go in the rain on the banking.
Yeah, it really doesn't hardly change anything.
No.
Maybe certainly the brake zones do. Turn 1, you really can't brake offline because there's so many painted lines, and you're bending the car all the way through there that it's just too wide of an arc to try to brake offline. But that one can be a little bit sketchy. But pretty much all the ones in the infield, you can brake to the offline side, and then look for a little bit of grip offline through the apex, and then the back zone or back straight for the bus stop, you can brake a little bit offline fairly easy. So not a tremendously difficult place in the rain. Just you have a lot of high-speed brake zones, some of which don't have a lot of runoff, so it can be common to have nice slow off with just a front lockup on the infield. If in 3 or 5, if you get a lockup and don't realize it soon enough, you can pretty quickly slide off, get in the grass, and then you can't slow anything down there. So do be careful of those. But pretty fun place actually in the wet.
Yeah.
And the passing map, lots of green. There's not a whole lot that restricts you from passing anywhere. In one, you can pass all the way down to the apex. Then typically it's not a great idea to be too wide through the S's, especially at the apex at 2. Right after the apex, it opens up again. You have a nice, clean 2 wide, 3 wide brake zone in the 3. So that's a good spot to get it done. It's really not worth trying to force the issue too much through the S's. Kind of the same thing at 4. You've got a nice long straightaway ahead of it. If you can drag race somebody out of the horseshoe, it's not really worth trying to force the issue and go too wide through the apex of 4. Just try to set somebody up to outbrake them into 5. Even if it means going the outside, sometimes you can go down the outside, brake really deep, and get kind of force them to run a tighter line on the entry, and then you get a nice good drive off the corner and beat them on the drag run down to turn 6. Again, at turn 6, you can go too wide. It's not that big of a deal, but a lot of times it's not going to be helpful. So try to get the pass done on the brakes on the way in, or work on getting the better drive off the corner and getting it done on the straightaway. And then through the bus stop, it's pretty one lane, easy to make an outbraking maneuver on the way in. Just try to get it done by the apex, and then it's pretty much lead follow through until the last apex. and you get to run out and try to time somebody. But it's really tricky sometimes working on how to time the pass with the draft around the front. You can, especially if you're following somebody that's really close in car performance, you have to play with whether it's 2 car lengths or 3 car lengths or 5, that you want to be behind as you're coming out of the bus stop with a little bit of run. You might, whether you're a mile an hour or half a mile an hour, whatever, makes a big difference on if you catch up too quickly and then you have to pop out of the draft, as you're coming around to kind of pit in area before the trio. If you're popping out too early, then you kind of lose that momentum. So you want to be able to time it to where you're getting alongside, more along start finish, and you kind of outbreak somebody down into one. But fun stuff to play with, definitely the draft.
Yeah, I just want to point one thing out in the bus stop. It's surprising how many people that you see actually try to make a pass, not going into the bus stop, while being in the bus stop. And it's a point where it's so fast, and the driver that you are passing is no longer looking in the mirrors because they are so busy looking where they want to place the car for good exit, whatever it may be. So they may not pay attention or have realized that you may be next to them, or they're at the limit of the tire, so they can't not keep the car where it needs to be relative to where you position to them. So instead of taking the risk, make sure you study the driver. If the person is so slow that obviously they have all the tire available to them and they run a tight line and don't know exactly where to position a car, that can be dangerous in itself. But obviously they may stay tight to where you are, can go easily out on the outside in the middle of the bus stop. But if that was to happen and you are coming up on somebody, just time coming into the bus stop. Break a little earlier. Time, kind of judge where you think they may be when you're in a bus stop, so you can pick up the throttle even earlier because you now have more tire available for your good acceleration, so you'll pass them on the exit of the bus stop. I have seen so many cars having contact in the bus stop, and very often does it put both cars out of the race.
Yeah. And also, if you're the lead car and, there's an out-of-class faster car coming behind, but they're pretty far back, you don't think they're going to really make it. Sometimes, just move 2-3 feet into the left and kind of signal to them that it's better to wait. I'm going to go deep here. You fall in behind. You can pass me later. Something that subtle can really, can tell the faster car behind that it's a better idea to wait. Whereas if you leave it totally wide open and you go all the way out right, then they're like, well, I really want to stick it down in there. And then it kind of becomes this, ambiguous game of, do I turn in? Is he there? And so it's better to kind of make it a little bit more definitive.
Yeah.
All right. And then again, there's the schedule of what we've done already this year. All of those available on demand already on the website at circuitstudies.com. And I think that'll be it. We'll switch over if we have anybody that wants to ask a couple questions. Go ahead and do that. A couple people here still. Let's see if anybody wants to add anything on the chat. But yeah, we appreciate you guys joining us. And if you think of questions later, or if you just don't want to ask it now, if you have something specific to your car or whatever, shoot us an email. Let us know. We will send you a replay video here shortly with this whole presentation, as well as a PDF document with the full PowerPoint slides and links to videos and stuff for you to check out. So if you go through all that and we haven't covered something, let us know. We'll try our best. One other thing while I'm thinking about it is car setup stuff. It's a very unusual track. With the banking, you have high tire loads, high speeds. So it's really critical to make sure you're checking tire temps and pressures. Make sure you're not building up a lot of temperature, on the inside of a wheel. If you're running the same camber that you would typically run at another track, a lot of times that makes a lot of heat on that inside of the tire. So you don't want to create a failure with something that you could easily change. So typically lower cambers, lower toes, try to reduce the drag in the car, and make sure you're not overheating a tire for no reason. That'll also, the lower cambers will help with the braking too.
Yeah, and to that point, what Mike just said about very often tire manufacturers will recommend higher tire pressure. So if you have somebody there from the tire manufacturer that you're using, make sure you ask them. Or if you think they're not going to be there, try to get a hold of somebody that you can call because if you're running and starting off with the lower pressures that you do at other tracks, very often you'll have a tire that has too much load on it with too little air, and that can generate a disastrous situation. So make sure you double check on that. And there may be somebody that's been there many times and know what tire pressure is. So make sure you check in on that for the purpose of absolute safety.
And I mean, it kind of goes without saying, but just to be sure, make sure you nut and bolt the car. The speeds are higher here than anywhere else, and sometimes it's not a habit for everybody. But make sure the prep level is very high. Make sure everything's well conditioned and ready to go out there, because you will have high speeds, and something that might be a minor failure at another track could be pretty serious around Daytona. Not to scare you, but certainly it's worth being careful about it. And if for whatever reason you do have some sort of problem on the banking or whatever, just try to pinch the car down to the left, spin it down, lock it up, and try to get the car to spin to the left side, because there's only one way to go on the right, and you're going to hit a wall. So try to take it the other way and hope for the best.
Yeah. So definitely a fun track. I know a lot of people that has this as their favorite track, pretty easy to learn, but you can also see it has its nuances, especially some of those places where exit speed is critical, and definitely treat it with respect. Obviously, it's been made a lot safer here over the last couple of years with the bigger runoff areas. But if you do overcharge some corners or make a big mistake, those walls can come at you quickly. So treat it with respect, have fun at it, and it's very rewarding. And there's nothing like going close to the wall at Daytona.
Yep. All right. I'm not seeing any more questions here on the chat, so we'll go ahead and close it out. If you have anything later, let us know.
Yeah, shoot us an email. Thank you.
Bye.
Are we good?